So I think the original grain of the idea happened shortly after Brexit. And it's so weird now because Brexit feels like a long time ago. But at the time, it was just the first really bad thing to happen in a long time. And I remember so vividly living in London, and overnight all my friends were suddenly worried about the kind of passport they had. Whether their British passport, which had once been something so, something they never even thought about, was suddenly this thing that was going to change, and they were now going to, not have the right to work in European countries. And suddenly I, as an Irish person living in London with an EU passport, I had the good travel document. And it really struck me as being this bizarre thing, how overnight your rights to work abroad could change, the documents that kind of defined your existence could change. And I was like, wow, this is a conversation that people all over the world have been having for generations. But for my little enclave in southeast London, it was the first time that conversation was happening. And it struck me then that this is an idea for something. And I think that's where a lot of fantasy comes from, is that when something in the real world feels so strange that you feel like fantasy is the only way to explore it. So, people always talk about maps in fantasy and how all great fantasy books begin with a map full of islands and archipelagos and all that kind of stuff. But for me, my entire house was just filled with XY diagrams. It was so when I was planning on how these worlds should be, I drew an X line, and the X sort of represented temperature. So on this side very cold, on this side very hot, and then a Y line, and the further north you went, the faster time went, and the further south you went, the slower time went. And then really it was this I'm not somebody who knows geography very well. I don't think I even did it for Leaving Cert, but I just plotted different worlds with their different placements on the map and experimented and really thought about what it would be like if a world were to develop in, for example, a very dry, hot place, but also where the time was moving really fast. And if we think about what we know about our world already, we know that a lot of desert countries tend to have a lot of oil in them. And so I thought wow, okay, well, what if you have this hot, dry desert countries, but time is moving so fast? So that means all kinds of resources are developing under the earth. And that means even though the people are living and dying really quickly, it becomes an extremely valuable resource for southern worlds to take advantage of. And then it all just kind of appears out of that. So by using this very simple XY axis that I learned in school, I was able to kind of build not just one world, but many. I guess the thing about it is that you have to consider absolutely everything. So for every novel I've ever written, I've taken it for granted that, everyone's heard of, God, and everyone basically knows what a euro, a pound, or a dollar is, because those are the currencies I'd been dealing with before. But the idea, every time I got to a scene where people were buying something, or even swearing, there's so much adventure that happens in this book, and they're oh my, and is it God or is it gods? What kind of religious system are they adhering to? So I think that is the real challenge with fantasy world building, is you have to think of absolutely everything. Even if you think of one part of it and you really I had a lot of fun thinking about eating traditions in these different worlds, but you can't just focus on the bits that you find interesting. You have to develop everything. So Margot and Moon are the two protagonists of this book, and the whole story is told with alternating chapters from each of their perspectives. And we learn very quickly that Moon is a traveling salesman who has lived his life on the road. He comes from a nomadic tradition of people who are always moving around from world to world, called the Lunati. They follow the full moon, and the kind of worshipping of the full moon has given them this special kind of ability in order to make silver. And something I really loved about creating Moon's character is that because his religion specifically means that he kind of gets free money, he gets a small amount of free money that comes from his religion specifically, but how that makes other people in the world treat him, and how the similarities I could then build between how people in our world feel about people who they think get free money, and how prejudice often grows around that. And then Margot, on the other hand, is just like a regular girl from our world. And she, when we meet her at the beginning, she is on her way to boarding school. Her father has died 2 years ago, and she's never quite readjusted to normal life after that. And she doesn't really get on with her mum. And she does seem like a kind of an every girl, like, and very, really quite normal. But really, as the book goes on, you kind of realize that Margot is one of those people who it takes her leaving home to realize she's been brought up in a very unusual way, even if it was unusual in quite a subtle way. God, romance is one of the hardest things to write. It really, really is. Particularly when you're talking about young people, you know, and like I think when you're, because I write for adults as well, when I'm writing for adults, you can really get into sexual chemistry pretty early, but for young people, you don't want to rush to that conclusion quite so quickly. But when I was writing this romance specifically, I really thought a lot about what these two characters who've grown up in these two wildly different ways and have completely different experiences of reality, what they are both missing that they've been looking for their whole lives and they don't realize they've been looking for. And I think for Margot and Moon, it's that they've been lonely for a long time without even realizing they're lonely, you know? And I also think that a big part of any successful relationship, not to mind romance, is, does the person that you're with expand your view of the world or confine it? You know, you want somebody who's sort of taking you by the hand and making you burst out of your comfort zone, rather than the person who's like, oh, that is a bit scary, maybe we should stay inside tonight. And for Margot and Moon, I think it's definitely the former.